The wind never stopped. It was a constant, weary sigh across the plains, a lonely sound that scraped a man's soul raw. It carried no promise of rain, only dust. The dust was a fine, pale powder that settled on everything, coating the world in a film of failure. It got in your eyes, in your throat, in the food. It was the taste of the land, and the land was dying. The sun was a merciless hammer in a white-hot sky, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth. The ground was a web of fissures, some wide enough to swallow a man's boot, as if the world itself were trying to break open and show the empty, barren heart beneath. The creek bed was a scar of bleached stones and dried mud. The skeletal remains of 2 scrawny cattle lay near the fence line, their bones picked clean by coyotes and vultures. A stark monument to a rancher's withered hope. This was the Vance homestead, a place slowly being erased by the elements, returning to the dust from which it was carved. Inside the small, bleak cabin, Alara Vance pushed a needle through the worn fabric of her father's shirt. The thread was a different color from the faded calico, a small, sad patch on a garment of patches. Her hands, though chapped and calloused now, moved with a delicate precision that spoke of another life. She held her back straight, her shoulders set, a posture learned in a schoolroom in Ohio, a place with green lawns and gentle rain, a memory so distant it felt like a dream belonging to someone else. Here, in this suffocating one-room world, such grace was a foreign language. She looked at her father, Silas. He sat at the rough-hewn table, staring into a tin cup as if it held the answers to all his troubles. It held only whiskey, the cheap, burning kind that offered a moment's forgetfulness and a lifetime of regret. He was a ghost of the man who had brought them west, the man who had promised her a kingdom of grass and sky. That man had been full of laughter and strength, his eyes bright with the future. This man was a hollow shell, his shoulders slumped in permanent defeat, his eyes dull and evasive. The land had broken him, the drought had ground him down, and the whiskey was burying what was left. He had not met her eyes in a week, not since the first time the man from the Thorn Ranch had come calling. A deep, cold dread was a constant knot in Alara's stomach. She loved her father, loved the memory of the man he had been, and it was that love that made his current weakness so agonizing. She saw the shame that consumed him, the guilt that made his hands tremble when he poured his drink. He was trapped, and in his desperation, he was building a cage for her. She could feel the bars closing in with every gust of that relentless, dusty wind. The sound of hoofbeats made her flinch, the needle pricking her finger. A drop of blood, bright and alive, welled on the tip. She quickly put it to her mouth, the coppery taste sharp on her tongue. Silas looked up, his face ashen, a cornered animal hearing the hunter's approach. He did not need to look out the single grimy window to know who it was. The visit had been promised. The horse, a powerful black gelding, stopped outside. The shadow of a man fell across the open doorway, blocking the harsh afternoon light. He did not knock. Men like him never did. He was Abel Kane, Bartholomew Thorne's foreman, a man carved from the same hard rock as the canyons that surrounded them. He was not tall, but broad and thick, his presence filling the small cabin, sucking the air from it. A heavy pistol was strapped to his hip, its grip worn smooth. His eyes, small and dark under the brim of his hat, swept the room with a look of bored appraisal, as if he were inspecting livestock. They passed over Silas with a flicker of contempt, and then settled on Alara. They lingered on her face, her hair, the line of her neck. It was not a look of admiration. It was a look of ownership, a cold, possessive inventory that made her skin crawl and her blood run cold. She wanted to shrink away, to hide, but the part of her that remembered green lawns and a life of dignity refused. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady, and held it until he gave a small, humorless smirk, and turned his attention back to her father. "Vance," Kane said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "Mr. Thorne is a patient man, but his patience has its limits. The note is past due. The winter is coming. You got nothing left to sell, and your credit is as dry as that creek bed." Silas swallowed, his throat working. "I know," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I just need a little more time. If the rains come." Cain let out a short, ugly laugh. "The rains ain't coming, old man. Hope is a poor currency in this territory. But Mr. Thorne is a generous man. He's willing to make you an offer. An offer that clears your debt completely." He paused, letting the words hang in the suffocating silence. "And he'll see you have enough grain to make it through to spring." Silas stared at his empty cup, unable to look at either the foreman or his daughter. He already knew the terms. They had been laid out a week ago. But hearing them spoken aloud in Alara's presence was a fresh new hell. Cain's gaze slid back to Alara, his smirk widening. "He finds your daughter, pleasing, a fine woman, wasted out here in this dust bowl. A man like Mr. Thorne can offer her a good life. Silks, a proper house. She'll be the lady of the biggest ranch in this territory. She's educated," Silas mumbled, a pathetic, desperate bid for a value beyond flesh and bone. "She can read and write proper. He has a bookkeeper for that," Cain said dismissively. "The agreement stands. Her hand in marriage. The wedding to be arranged before the first snow. In exchange, the debt is wiped clean. And a wagon of grain will be delivered to you by week's end." He looked from the broken father to the silent daughter. "Mr. Thorne expects your final answer tomorrow. In town, at the saloon. We'll have the papers drawn up." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out, his spurs jingling with a sound of finality. The shadow left the doorway, and the harsh, unforgiving light flooded back in. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then Alara slowly placed the shirt she was mending on the table. Her movements were stiff, controlled. She looked at her father, whose head was now buried in his trembling hands. "Father," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with a furious energy. "Look at me." He did not move. "Look at me," she repeated, her voice rising, cracking, slowly, painfully. He lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with tears. The guilt was a raw, open wound on his face. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "You cannot." "Alara, what choice do I have?" he rasped, his words choked with self-pity. "We're starving. We have nothing left. The land is dead. Thorne will take everything anyway. He'll run us off, and we'll die in a ditch somewhere." "There is always a choice," she pleaded, moving around the table to stand before him. She gripped his shoulders, her fingers digging into the thin, worn fabric of his shirt. "We can leave. We can walk away from this place. We can go somewhere else. I can work. I can teach. I can clean. I can do anything. But not this. Father, please. He is a cruel man. You know the stories they tell about him." Bartholomew Thorne was a name whispered with fear and a certain grudging respect. He had come to the territory with money and ambition and had crushed anyone who stood in his way. He was said to be a man of cold appetites, who saw the world and everyone in it as something to be bought and owned. To be his wife was not to be a partner, but a possession. "They're just stories." Silas wept, his tears falling freely now. "He's a powerful man. He can protect you, give you a better life than this." He gestured feebly at the bleak cabin, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. A bitter, hysterical laugh escaped Alara's lips. "A better life? As his property, sold to him like a horse or a sack of flour? Is that the life you wanted for me when you read me poetry by the fire? When you taught me my letters? You told me my mind was a gift, that I should never let anyone put a price on my spirit. I was a fool," he sobbed, his body shaking. "A proud, stupid fool. I dreamed too big. The land doesn't care about poetry, Alara. It only cares about strength, and I have none left." Her anger gave way to a wave of desperate sorrow. She knelt before him, her hands still on his shoulders, her face level with his. "Then find it," she begged, her voice breaking. "Find it now. For me, we will face this together. We will survive this together, but not like this. Do not sell me. Father, please do not sell your only child." For a moment, She saw a flicker of the man he used to be in his eyes, a flash of shame so profound it seemed to sear him from the inside. He looked at his daughter, his beautiful, strong daughter, and he knew what he was doing was a sin beyond redemption. But the fear was stronger than the shame. The fear of starvation, the fear of the cold, the fear of dying alone and forgotten in the dirt. He had chosen his own survival over her soul. He pulled away from her grasp and stood up, stumbling back towards the bottle on the table. He would not look at her. He could not. "We go to town tomorrow," he said, his voice flat and dead. "It's already done." The ride to town was a silent, miserable procession. Silas rode their one remaining nag, a sway-backed mare with ribs like a washboard. Elara walked beside him, her feet sinking into the deep dust of the trail. She had put on her only good dress, a simple blue cotton frock that was faded from the sun and mended in a dozen places. She felt a profound and chilling numbness, as if she were watching her own life from a great distance. The father she had loved was gone, replaced by this shuffling, guilt-ridden stranger. The future she had once imagined, however modest, had been erased. There was only this, a dusty trail leading to a saloon where she would be traded like chattel. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a land office, and the saloon. It was a place of transit, a place of crude judgment and little hope, where tired men came to spend their money on whiskey and fleeting comfort before heading back out into the vast, unforgiving emptiness. The saloon was the town's beating heart. The bat-wing doors swung open and shut, spilling the sounds of tinny piano music and rough laughter into the street. Silas slid off the horse, his movements clumsy. He would not look at her. He tethered the mare to the hitching post and then took her arm in a surprisingly firm grip, as if he feared she might bolt. He practically dragged her towards the entrance. She did not resist. There was nowhere to run. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of stale beer, cheap whiskey, sweat, and sawdust. A haze of smoke hung in the air, catching the afternoon light that streamed through the dirty windows. A few prospectors hunched over the bar, and a table of cowhands played a listless game of cards. All conversation stopped as Silas pulled Elara into the room. Every eye turned to her. She felt their gazes like physical things, curious, crude, speculative. She lifted her chin, her face a pale, proud mask, and refused to let them see her terror. In a dark corner, away from the bar, a man sat alone at a small table. He nursed a single glass of whiskey, and his stillness was a stark contrast to the saloon's nervous energy. This was Jedediah Stone. He was in town for supplies, a rare trip he made only when absolutely necessary. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth. A faded scar cut through his left eyebrow. His hands, resting on the table, were broad and scarred, the knuckles thick. But it was his eyes that held you. They were a pale, clear gray, watchful and quiet, and they seemed to see everything. They had seen more than their share of trouble and sorrow, and it had left a permanent caution in them. He had noticed the girl the moment she stepped through the doors. He saw past the dusty dress and the fear in her eyes. He saw a quiet dignity, a flicker of a fire that the world was trying hard to stamp out. He had seen women like her before, women brought low by bad luck or bad men. It was a common enough story. But there was something about this one, the proud set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine, that snagged his attention. He watched as her father, reeking of desperation, led her towards a back table where Abel Kane sat waiting, a stack of papers and a bottle in front of him. Jed lowered his gaze to his glass, but he kept listening. The saloon slowly returned to its low hum of activity, but the tension from the back table was a palpable thing. "Right on time, Vance," Kane drawled. Not bothering to stand, he gestured to the chair opposite him. Silas pushed Elara into it before slumping into the one beside her. Kane poured 3 glasses. Silas grabbed his immediately. his hand shaking so badly some of it sloshed onto the table. Ilara did not touch hers. "The papers are all here," Kane said, tapping the stack. "Standard marriage contract, all legal and binding. Your mark here." He pointed a thick finger at a line on the bottom of a page. "And your debt to Mr. Thorne is erased. Gone. The grain wagon will be at your place by sundown tomorrow." Silas stared at the paper as if it were a snake. He looked at the ink pot, then at the pen lying next to it. He looked at Ilara, a quick, darting glance full of misery, and then looked away. Ilara's voice was clear and cold in the suddenly quiet room. "I will not sign it." Kane ignored her, his eyes fixed on Silas. "Control your woman. Vance, this is business between men." "She ain't his woman yet." One of the card players snickered. A few others laughed. "She just needs to make her mark." "Father," Ilara said, her voice low and intense. A final, desperate appeal. "Or you need to, is that all I am worth to you? Is this how it ends?" Kane was losing his patience. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Listen to me, old man. This is the only deal on the table. You think you can walk out of here? You owe Mr. Thorne a considerable sum. He can have you thrown in a cell for it. He can take your land, your horse, everything. You will leave with nothing. This is not a request. You will sign, or you will regret it." He pushed the paper and the pen toward Silas. "Sign it." Silas looked at the paper, then at the bottle, then at the foreman's hard, unforgiving face. He was drowning, and this was the only hand reaching for him, even if it meant pulling his daughter under with him. Kane leaned back, a triumphant smirk on his face. He looked at the bartender. "Everything is settled. We'll take a bottle for the road. The arrangement is made." He glanced around the room, making sure everyone heard him, making sure everyone understood the power of Bartholomew Thorne. "The girl for the grain." The phrase hung in the smoky air. Simple, brutal. The final, damning summary of a life's worth. In the corner, Jedediah Stone's head came up. The words hit him like a physical blow. The girl for the grain. Something inside him. Something long dormant and calloused over by years of solitude and loss. Snapped. He had seen men bought and sold. Seen lives ruined by greed and weakness. He had made it his business to look the other way. To mind his own concerns. To survive. But this was different. This was a man selling his own child in a public saloon like a piece of meat. The quiet dignity he had seen in the girl's eyes made the transaction a sacrilege. He pushed his chair back, the sound of the wood scraping against the floorboards unnaturally loud. He stood up. He was not as broad as Kane, but he was taller, with a lean, hard strength that spoke of a life of relentless labor. Every eye in the saloon turned to him. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the haze like a whip crack. "You're selling her for grain." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a cold, quiet fury that was more frightening than any shout. Kane's head swiveled towards him, his eyes narrowing. "This is no concern of yours. Cowboy, sit down and finish your drink." Jed took a slow step forward, away from the shadows of his corner. He ignored Kane. He looked at Silas, whose face had gone from ashen to chalk white. "Is that what she's worth to you? A few sacks of feed and a clear ledger?" Before Silas could stammer a reply, or Kane could rise from his chair, Jed did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it and emptied its contents onto the bar. A few silver dollars and a handful of smaller coins rolled across the wood. It was not much. It was almost everything he had. "This covers his whiskey debt," Jed said to the bartender. Then he turned his gaze back to the table. His eyes settled on Ilara, and for the first time, he spoke directly to her. His voice was rough, but it held a steady, unwavering certainty that silenced the entire room. He ignored Kane. He ignored her father. He spoke to her as if they were the only two people in the world. "I'll take her home myself." A profound, stunned silence fell over the saloon. The piano players' hands froze over the keys. The card players held their hands mid-play. Silas stared, his mouth agape. Kane's face was a mask of disbelief turning slowly to rage, and Alara, who had been numbly resigning herself to a fate worse than death, stared at the stranger. She looked into the clear, gray eyes of this weathered, scarred man who had just stepped out of the shadows and irrevocably, impossibly, altered her life with 6 quiet words. Abel Kane's face contorted, disbelief hardening into a mask of pure rage. He started to rise, his hand instinctively dropping to the butt of his pistol. "You got a death wish, stranger," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous threat. Jedediah Stone did not so much as glance at the foreman's weapon. His pale gray eyes remained fixed on Alara, holding her in their steady, unreadable gaze. He did not move, did not tense. He simply stood there, a tall, weathered monument of silent opposition. And in his stillness, there was a potency that gave even a man like Kane pause. The saloon had fallen into a breathless hush. The bartender stood with a rag frozen in his hand. The card players had laid their cards face down on the table. It was the collective, silent judgment of men who knew injustice when they saw it, even if they lacked the sand to challenge it themselves. Their quiet attention was a weight, a silent jury that pinned Kane to his spot, with a deliberation that was almost insulting. Jed turned his head slightly toward Silas Vance, who was staring at him with the slack-jawed expression of a man who had seen a ghost. "Your daughter is leaving with me," Jed stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He then walked to the bar, his worn boots making a soft, rhythmic scuff on the floorboards. He gestured to the coins he had poured out earlier. "For his drink," Jed said to the bartender, indicating Silas, "and for whatever else he drank his courage away with." The words were laced with a contempt so cold it was a wonder they didn't freeze the air. It was an act of finality, a severing. He was not buying Alara. He was settling the account of the man who had sold her. He turned and walked back towards the table. He stopped not in front of her father or the fuming foreman, but beside Alara. He did not touch her. He simply looked down at her and said, in that same quiet, unhurried voice, "It's time to go." For a heartbeat, she was paralyzed, caught in the undertow of shock. She was being passed from one man to another. A piece of property in a transaction she had no say in, but this felt different. The foreman's eyes had stripped her bare. Her father's had slid away in shame. This man's eyes simply saw her. He was not looking at a prize to be won or a debt to be paid. He was looking at a person. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she rose to her feet. "She's not going anywhere with you." Kane spat, finally finding his voice, but it lacked its earlier conviction. He remained seated, a predator uncertain of the new animal that had entered his territory. Jed did not answer him. He simply waited for Alara to stand, then turned and began walking towards the door. After a moment's hesitation, her legs obeyed a command her mind had not yet given, and she followed him. The space he created in the silent, watching crowd was awake, and she was pulled along in it. As they reached the swinging doors, Kane's voice, raw with fury and humiliation, called after them. "Thorne will hear about this. You think you can steal from Bartholomew Thorne and just walk away? He will find you, wherever you go. He will hunt you down." Jed did not break stride. He pushed one of the doors open and held it for her, his back to the foreman's threats. Alara stepped out into the blinding, dusty sunlight, her lungs gasping for clean air. The saloon doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the venomous promise. Their departure was a blur. Jed untied his horse, a sturdy buckskin with intelligent eyes, from the hitching post. He swung the heavy sacks of flour and beans he had purchased onto its back with an economy of motion that spoke of immense strength. He did not speak to her, did not look at her. He seemed to be in a world of his own, focused solely on the task of leaving. Alara stood by the post, her hands clenched at her sides, her mind a maelstrom of terror and a fragile, bewildering sliver of relief. She had escaped. She had been saved from the monstrous fate of being Bartholomew Thorne's wife. But what had she been saved for? This silent, grim-faced stranger had claimed her as his own in front of a dozen witnesses. His reasons were a terrifying mystery. She was free of one cage only, it seemed, to be led to another. When he was done, he swung himself up into the saddle. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Can you keep a steady pace?" he asked. It was the first question he had directed at her. She gave a short, stiff nod. "Then walk on the left side. It'll keep you out of the worst of the dust from my horse." And with that, he nudged the buckskin forward. Ilara, with no other choice on God's earth, fell into step beside him. A prisoner walking alongside her captor, a survivor following her savior. Her father's sway-backed mare was still tied to the post. Silas had not come out. He had taken the coins and stayed with the whiskey. She did not look back. They journeyed into a vast and indifferent wilderness. The trail leaving town quickly dissolved into the immense, open plains, a sea of pale, sun-scorched grass that whispered and hissed in the ceaseless wind. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, an endless dome that seemed to press down on the world, dwarfing the two small figures moving across it. The land was an adversary, magnificent in its brutality. They rode through canyons where the setting sun set the towering rock walls ablaze with colors of blood and fire, and the silence was so profound it rang in the ears. They crossed prairies so wide and empty that the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains seemed to float on the horizon, never getting any closer. The sun was a relentless furnace during the day, and at night, the temperature plummeted, the cold seeping into their bones under a blanket of stars so bright and close they seemed to mock the darkness below. For 3 days, they moved in near total silence. The only sounds were the plodding hoofbeats of the horse, the creak of saddle leather, and the sighing of the wind. The silence was a living thing between them, a chasm of unspoken fear and distrust. Ilara walked with her head down. Her world narrowed to the sight of her own worn boots scuffing through the dust and the powerful, steady rhythm of the horse beside her. She expected the worst. At any moment, she anticipated a rough hand, a cruel word, a demand. She had been bought, in a sense, and she waited for the bill to come due, but it never did. Jedediah Stone was a man locked within himself. He rode with a stoic mask, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the land with a practiced ease. He was a man who had made a covenant with solitude, and the sudden constant presence of this woman was a profound disruption. He could feel her fear, her suspicion. It was a tangible thing, like heat rising from the ground. He did not know how to ease it. Words did not come easy to him. Comfort was a language he had long forgotten. His past was a locked room, and he had thrown away the key years ago, after sickness had claimed his wife and son, leaving him with nothing but the silence he had wrapped around himself like a shroud. This sudden, violent act of intervention in the saloon had been a reflex, an old instinct he thought had died, and now he was left with the consequences, a terrified woman who looked at him as if he were a wolf. On the third afternoon, the sky turned against them. The brilliant blue bruised to a dark, angry purple in the west. The wind picked up, carrying a chill that promised more than just dust. The air grew heavy, electric. Jed pulled his horse to a halt, his eyes on the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice flat. "A bad one. We need shelter." He urged the horse forward at a faster pace, and Ilara had to half-jog to keep up. The landscape had changed, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills and rocky outcrops. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, splattered against the dry earth, raising the scent of dust and ozone. Then the heavens opened. A torrential downpour descended, a solid, blinding sheet of water that soaked them to the bone in seconds. The wind howled, and a deafening clap of thunder cracked directly overhead, making the ground tremble. Lightning split the sky, illuminating a stark, terrifying landscape. "In here," Jed shouted over the roar of the storm. He had found a shallow cave, little more than a deep overhang in a rock face. He slid from his horse, pulling it in under the ledge as far as it would go. Ilara scrambled in after him, her dress plastered to her skin, her hair hanging in wet ropes. She was shivering, as much from shock as from cold. The cave was small, barely large enough for the two of them and the horse. They were pressed close, their shoulders almost touching. Outside, the storm raged, a primal fury of wind and water and light, huddled in the dark. The noise was a constant, deafening roar. Alara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent trembling of her body. Jed unstrapped a bedroll from behind his saddle. Without a word, he unrolled it and draped the heavy, oiled canvas over her shoulders. It smelled of horse and leather and faint wood smoke. It was stiff and rough, but it blocked the wind, and a small measure of warmth began to seep into her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide in the gloom. In the brief, strobing flashes of lightning, she saw his face. The hard lines seemed softer, the stoic mask momentarily gone. She saw not a captor, but a man, cold and wet and weary, his jaw tight against a shiver of his own. For the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in him, a shared humanity in the face of the storm's violence. He noticed her watching him, and he turned his face away, staring out at the deluge as if uncomfortable with her gaze. He stood his ground, a solid wall between her and the storm, and she watched the quiet, resolute set of his shoulders. She noticed he did not complain about the cold. He did not curse the storm. He simply endured it, and in his quiet resilience, he saw a mirror of her own. She had not wept, had not pleaded, had not broken. They were two solitary, battered souls, weathering the same storm in a small pocket of shared silence. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The air was cool and fresh. They emerged from the cave into the late afternoon light, the sun breaking through the clouds to paint the wet landscape in hues of gold and rose. The silence now was different. The tension had been washed away with the rain, leaving a fragile, quiet space between them. The next day brought another kind of trial. They were making their way through a narrow, rock-strewn arroyo when Jed's horse suddenly shied, snorting in alarm. Jed was off the saddle in an instant, moving with a speed that was startling. He landed silently on the balls of his feet, his hand already pushing Alara back behind him. "Stay still," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Alara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. There, coiled in the shade of a rock not 10 feet from where she'd been about to step, was a rattlesnake. Its triangular head was raised, its tail a blur of motion, the dry buzzing sound an ancient, deadly warning. It was thick as a man's arm, its diamond-patterned skin merging with the dappled shadows. Before she could even fully register the danger, Jed acted. He did not reach for the rifle on his saddle. In one fluid, seamless motion, he drew the long knife from his belt and threw it. The blade spun through the air, a silver arc of light, and embedded itself in the snake's head with a sickening thud, pinning it to the ground. The rattling stopped. The thick body writhed for a moment, and then was still. The entire event had taken less than 5 seconds. Jed walked forward calmly, pulled his knife free, and wiped it clean on the leg of his trousers before sheathing it. He did not seem shaken. He did not seem proud. It was simply a thing that had needed doing, and he had done it. Alara stared at the dead snake, then back at him. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She had been a single step away from a painful, lonely death. He had moved without hesitation, placing himself between her and the danger. He had protected her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. For the first time since leaving her home, she felt a flicker of something other than fear in his presence. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, a sense of safety that was both frightening and deeply comforting. This man was not just her captor, he was her protector. That evening, they made camp in a small grove of cottonwoods by a trickling stream. He built a small, smokeless fire with practiced skill, and soon the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. He handed her a tin plate of food and a cup of coffee without a word, and they ate in their customary silence. But tonight, the silence felt different again. It was less a chasm and more of a shared space. The stars came out, thick and brilliant in the clear, dark sky. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the stream. Alara looked at his face, illuminated by the soft firelight. She watched his scarred hands as he cleaned his plate with a piece of bread. The question that had been burning inside her for days finally rose to her lips. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers across the fire. He knew what she was asking. He looked away, staring into the flames as if searching for an answer there. He was quiet for so long she thought he would not reply. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, hesitant. He struggled with the words, as if they were unfamiliar shapes in his mouth. "I've seen a lot of things out here," he said, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "Hard things, men doing what they must to survive. But that," he shook his head slightly, a small, frustrated motion. "A man selling his own blood, talking about you like you were just a thing, just another commodity to be traded." He fell silent again, and the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. "I couldn't abide the sight of it," he finished, the words clipped and final. He looked at her then, and in his eyes, she saw no guile, no hidden motive. She saw only a simple, unshakable certainty. It was not about saving her, not in a grand, heroic sense. It was about a line that had been crossed in that saloon, a line that his own quiet, battered soul would not allow him to ignore. He was not the brute she had feared, nor the romantic savior from a storybook. He was just a man with a moral compass so deeply ingrained it had forced him to act, even against his own solitary nature. And in that simple, honest admission, the last of her fear of him finally dissolved, replaced by a fragile, tentative shoot of trust. They traveled for 2 more days, climbing higher into the rugged foothills of the mountains. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The land was harsher here, but possessed a stark, breathtaking beauty. Finally, late one afternoon, he pulled his horse to a stop on a ridge overlooking a long, narrow valley. Down below, nestled against the steep, pine-covered slope of the valley wall, was a small log cabin. A plume of smoke did not rise from its stone chimney. A simple lean-to barn stood beside it. A few acres of land around it had been cleared, enclosed by a rough split-rail fence. Beyond that, there was nothing. Nothing but the immense, silent wilderness stretching out in every direction. A vast, lonely expanse of rock and timber and sky. The isolation was absolute, overwhelming. It was a place a man could disappear from the world entirely. Jed sat on his horse, looking down at it for a long moment, his face grim. Then he nudged the buckskin forward, down the winding rocky trail into the valley. They stopped in front of the cabin. It was small, sturdy, and utterly stark. The logs were chinked with mud, the roof made of rough-hewn shakes. A single window stared out like a vacant eye. It was not a home, it was a shelter, a fortress against the wilderness. Jed swung down from his horse. He stood for a moment, his shoulders slumping with a weariness that seemed to go deeper than just the long journey. He gestured grimly with his chin towards the silent dwelling. "This is it," he said. Alara looked at the small, rough cabin. She looked at the lean-to barn, the empty corral. Then she looked past it, to the endless, untamed wilderness that surrounded them on all sides, a green and gray ocean that stretched to the horizon. She understood then, with a chilling, absolute clarity, that her old life was not just over, it had been utterly annihilated. She had been saved from one prison only to be delivered to another, a beautiful, terrifying cage of solitude and survival. And the real struggle had only just begun. The cabin was a world of its own, a small, rough-hewn box floating in an ocean of wilderness. Its 4 walls contained a universe of awkward, stifling intimacy. There was one room, one table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace that served as both furnace and stove. A curtain of patched flour sacks separated a corner where a simple cot had been placed for her, while his bedroll lay on the floor near the hearth. The space between them was never more than a few feet. Yet the emotional distance was as vast and uncrossable as the plains they had traversed. In this new world, Alara was an infant, clumsy and utterly useless. The life she had known had not prepared her for the raw, brutal mechanics of survival. Her hands, which knew the delicate art of embroidery and the elegant script of a well-formed letter, were clumsy and weak when faced with the demands of this life. The iron skillet was heavy and unwieldy. The first cornbread she tried to make was a blackened, smoking brick on the outside and a raw, doughy mess within. She burned her fingers, singed her dress, and filled the cabin with acrid smoke, her shame as thick and choking as the fumes. Hauling water from the creek was a Sisyphean torment. The wooden buckets were heavy even when empty, and filled to the brim. They seemed determined to tear her arms from their sockets. She would stumble back up the path, water sloshing over the sides, soaking her skirt and leaving a trail of dark, mocking spots on the thirsty ground. By the time she reached the cabin, the buckets were half empty, and her back was a knot of fire. Mending Jed's coarse canvas jacket was another humiliation. The fabric was thick and unforgiving, the needle difficult to push through. Her fine. Even stitches were impossible here. The best she could manage was a crooked, ugly seam that looked like a scar. She was a failure in every practical sense, a burden, and the knowledge was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. Jedediah Stone was a man of profound and unyielding patience, but his patience was wrapped in a thick blanket of distance. He never criticized her, never raised his voice. He simply watched her struggle for a time, then would step in and perform the task himself with an infuriating, silent efficiency. He showed her how to bank the coals in the fire to maintain a steady heat, how to properly grip the handle of the axe to split kindling, how to draw water without spilling half of it. He did not explain. He demonstrated. His movements were economical, stripped of all wasted effort, the result of 1,000 repetitions. He would show her once, then step back, leaving her to try again in his unnerving, quiet presence. He was a ghost in his own home, a man who seemed to take up as little space as possible. His days were a long, unbroken rhythm of hard labor. He was gone before sunrise to tend his small herd of cattle that grazed in the high meadows of the valley, and he returned at dusk, smelling of pine and sweat and earth. He was constantly working, reinforcing the barn against the coming winter, checking his trap lines, hunting for game. The work was his refuge, a wall he built around himself brick by brick, day by day. There were moments, however, when the wall would crack. Sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, he would watch her. He saw the proud set of her jaw as she wrestled with the water buckets, the frustration in her eyes when the thread broke again. He was drawn to her quiet, stubborn refusal to be completely broken. He saw the ghost of the refined woman she had been in the way she held her shoulders, in the graceful line of her neck. She was beautiful, even with her face smudged with soot and her hair coming loose from its pins. And this beauty was a dangerous complication in the sterile solitude of his life. He was afraid of it, afraid of the softness it stirred in the hard, fallow ground of his heart. So he would turn away, his face hardening into its familiar stoic mask, and find some new demanding chore to occupy his hands and his mind. For Elara, the days bled into one another in a gray, featureless haze of grief. The vast silence of the valley was a relentless echo of her own emptiness. She mourned not just for the loss of her home and her future, but for the loss of herself. She was no longer Elara Vance, the schoolmaster's daughter who read Shakespeare and dreamed of seeing the ocean. She was a nameless, useless woman in a rough cabin, a piece of human driftwood washed up on the shore of a stranger's life. Most of all, she mourned for her father. Not the weak, broken man who had sold her, but the father of her childhood. The man who had smelled of books and pipe smoke. The man whose laughter had been the warmest sound in the world. The memory of his final act of betrayal was a wound that would not close, a constant, aching source of anger and a sorrow so deep it felt like it was hollowing her out from the inside. There were times, when she went to the creek for water, that she would hide herself in the willows along the bank and weep. The tears would come in silent, shuddering waves, a storm of loss for which there was no shelter. She would cry until she was empty, then splashed the cold creek water on her face and returned to the cabin, her mask of numb composure firmly back in place. This bleak existence continued for weeks, a purgatory of silent meals and shared solitude. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. Ilara, overwhelmed by a feeling of utter futility, of being an object that simply existed in this space, decided she could not bear it for another minute. She had to do something, anything, to feel like a person again. Her eyes fell upon a small, dusty shelf near the fireplace. On it sat a single, leather-bound book. She took it down, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. It was a copy of the Bible. It was worn, the pages soft and thin from use. Inside the front cover, in a neat but faded hand, was written, Jedediah Mary Stone, May 1855. Below it, in a smaller, less certain script, was another name, Daniel. A pang of some unknown emotion went through her. These were the names of his ghosts. This was the only evidence that he had not always been this solitary, silent man. She opened the book and began to read. The familiar cadence of the Psalms, the stories of trial and faith, were a balm to her raw spirit. It was not just the words, but the act of reading itself, the simple act of engaging her mind, that felt like a lifeline. A new resolve took root in her. If she was to be a prisoner, she would not be a passive one. She would claim a piece of this world for herself. She started with the cabin. It was clean, in a purely functional way. But it was not a home. It was a man's shelter, a place of grim utility. She began a relentless campaign against the dust and the disorder. She swept the floor until the packed earth was smooth and even. She scrubbed the tabletop with sand from the creek until the wood grain showed through. She washed the grimy window, and for the first time, clear. Bright sunlight streamed into the gloomy interior. She took apart the patched flour sacks of her curtain, washed them, and sewed them back together with neat, even stitches. A small victory that felt monumental. She found a tin can and filled it with wildflowers from the meadow. She brought order to the chaos, a quiet, determined assertion of her own presence. The cabin was transformed. It was still small, still rough, but it was no longer just a shelter. It was a clean, orderly space. It was a home. Jed noticed. He did not say a word, but she saw it in the way his eyes swept the room when he entered that first evening. She saw him hesitate before placing his muddy boots by the door, instead taking them off on the stoop. She saw him run a hand over the clean-scrubbed table, a small, almost unconscious gesture. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. He had seen her strength, and a new, fragile respect began to grow in the space that had once held only suspicion and awkwardness. One day, in late autumn, the rhythmic monotony of their lives was broken by the distant sound of a ringing bell. A traveling peddler was making his way down the valley, his mule laden with pots, pans, tools, and bolts of cloth. He was a scrawny, talkative man named Phineas, his face a constant mask of cheerful gossip. For isolated homesteaders, men like Phineas were a vital link to the outside world, a source of news and goods. Jed traded a few good pelts for coffee, salt, and a new axe head. As Phineas measured out the coffee beans, his tongue ran on without pause, sharing news from the towns and homesteads along his route. And the drought's finally broken down on the southern plains. They say, too late for most, of course. Heard about that fellow Vance over in Redemption? The one with the pretty daughter who ran off with some quiet fella. He winked at Jed, oblivious. Poor soul. They found him a few weeks back, it seems in his grief. He took to the bottle something fierce, wandered out one night, drunk as a lord, and fell face first into the creek. Not enough water in it to drown a cat, but he was too far gone to lift his own head. Sad business. The grain he got for that deal he made wasn't enough to save him from himself, I suppose. Ilara, who had been standing in the cabin doorway, felt the world tilt on its axis. The peddler's cheerful, careless voice faded to a dull roar in her ears. The sunlight seemed to dim, the vibrant autumn colors of the valley turning to ash. He was gone. Her father was dead. drowned in a muddy creek bed. A pathetic, lonely end to a life that had once been so full of promise. The grain she had been sold for. He had gotten his prize, and it had killed him. A wave of blackness washed over her, and she gripped the door frame to keep from falling. The peddler, finally noticing her chalk-white face, had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Oh, beg pardon, ma'am, didn't realize." Jed cut him off, his voice low and hard as granite. "Your business is done here. Phineas, move on." He handed the man his pelts, his movements sharp and dismissive. The peddler, eager to escape the sudden, chilling atmosphere, quickly packed his mule and scurried away down the valley, his bell ringing a cheerful, obscene farewell. The silence he left behind was heavy, suffocating. Ilara stood frozen in the doorway, staring out at the valley but seeing nothing. She felt a grief so immense and complicated it threatened to tear her apart. It was a toxic brew of sorrow, rage, and a terrible, crushing guilt. She had hated him for what he had done, but she had loved him, too. And now he was gone forever, with no chance for forgiveness, no chance for redemption. She was an orphan. The last thread connecting her to her old life had been brutally snipped. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She turned without a word and walked back into the cabin, moving like an old woman. She sat on the edge of her cot, her back to the room, and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the splintering pieces of her world together. Jed stood outside for a long time, watching the peddler disappear. He knew this kind of grief. He knew its weight, its taste, its suffocating power. He scrubbed a hand over his weary face. The wall he had so carefully maintained around his heart was crumbling. He could not leave her to face this alone. He entered the cabin, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. He poured a cup of water from the bucket she had hauled that morning and brought it to her. She did not seem to notice. He stood beside her for a moment, then hesitantly sat on a nearby stool. Not too close, but not far either. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat with her in the gathering twilight, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the swirling chaos of her grief. He was a witness to her pain, and, in his silent vigil, there was more comfort than any words could have offered. Hours passed. The cabin grew dark. He rose once to light a lamp, its soft yellow glow pushing back the deepest of the shadows. Finally, his voice, rough and quiet, broke the long silence. "Fever took my wife," he said, his eyes on the floor. "Mary took our boy, Daniel, a few days later. It was a bad winter, 5 years back. There was nothing I could do, just had to watch." The confession was stark, brutal, delivered in short, clipped phrases, as if the words themselves were painful to form. He did not elaborate. He did not have to. In that brief, ragged admission of his own tragedy, he built a bridge across the chasm of their solitude. He had shown her his own scars, connecting his loss to hers. She was not alone in her grief. This silent, solitary man understood. She did not respond, but a single, hot tear finally escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not weep for her father, not then. She wept for the shared, universal sorrow of the world, for the boy named Daniel and the woman named Mary, and for the man who had been left to carry their ghosts alone. A week later, the first menacing shadow of their past fell across the valley. Jed rode in from the high pasture, his face set in a grim, hard line. He dismounted and walked towards the barn without a word. Ilara followed him, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Inside the barn, lying on a bed of clean straw, was one of his cattle. It was a young heifer, and its throat had been cut. It was not the work of a wolf or a mountain lion. The cut was too clean, too deliberate. It was the work of a man, a message. It was a waste of good meat, an act of pure malice, designed to intimidate and to wound. Jed stood over the dead animal, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He said nothing, but Ilara could feel the cold, controlled rage radiating from him. Bartholomew Thorne had not forgotten. He had been denied his prize, His authority had been challenged in a public saloon, and he was not a man who forgave such insults. This was his reply, a promise of what was to come. That night, Jed took his rifle down from the pegs above the fireplace. He cleaned and oiled it by the light of the lamp, his movements precise and deadly. When he was finished, he did not put it away. He leaned it against the wall by the door. He went to stand on the porch, staring out into the vast, moonlit darkness of the valley. The wilderness that had seemed a sanctuary now felt like a hunting ground. Alara came to stand in the cabin doorway behind him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold night air. The silence between them was no longer awkward or tense. It was the shared, watchful silence of allies. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance, living under one roof. The blood on the barn floor and the unspoken threat that hung in the air had changed everything. They were two people with a shared home, a shared enemy, and a shared will to survive. The dead heifer was a declaration of war. Its blood, dark and stark against the straw, drew a line between the fragile peace of the valley and the encroaching hatred of the outside world. The unspoken threat lingered in the air, a metallic taste of fear that changed the very quality of the silence between them. They were no longer simply two people sharing a roof. They were a garrison of two, and their small cabin was a fort standing against a coming siege. The shared danger burned away the last of their awkwardness, forging their separate solitudes into a single, sharp-edged partnership. The unspoken understanding was absolute. To survive, they had only each other. Jedediah Stone began to arm her. He had seen the terror in her eyes, but he had also seen the steel beneath it. He intended to give that steel a killing edge. Survival in this land was a harsh and unforgiving catechism, and he became its reluctant teacher. He started by taking her out into the valley, his long strides forcing her to keep a brisk pace. He taught her the language of the earth, a scripture written in broken twigs and disturbed soil. "See this?" he would say, his voice a low rumble as he knelt, pointing to a faint scuff in the dirt. "Deer, a doe and a fawn, passed this way this morning. You can tell by the depth of the track she wasn't spooked, just moving toward water." He showed her how to read the stories the animals left behind, how to tell a wolf track from a coyote's, how to spot the territorial scrapings of a mountain lion. He taught her which plants could kill and which could heal. He showed her the feathery leaves of the yarrow plant, good for stopping bleeding if you make a poultice, he explained, crushing a leaf between his calloused fingers. "And this, the purple flower, that's foxglove. Pretty, but it will stop your heart. Remember the difference." She became his apprentice, her sharp mind absorbing every detail, her memory a clean slate on which he etched the brutal, necessary knowledge of the wilderness. She was no longer a useless, displaced woman. She was learning to belong to this harsh and beautiful land in a way she never had before. The most important lesson came on a crisp autumn afternoon, the air smelling of pine and cold stone. He brought his heavy Winchester rifle down from its pegs. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. He led her outside, into the golden light that slanted across the valley. He set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. The rifle felt alien in her hands, a heavy, cold piece of machinery designed for one purpose. It smelled of oil and power. "It's got a kick," he warned. "Hold it tight to your shoulder, or it'll leave a bruise you won't soon forget." She tried to lift it, to aim it as she had seen him do, but it was awkward and heavy. Her stance was wrong. Her arms trembled under the weight. The barrel wavered, dancing in the air, the tin can a distant, impossible target. Jed let out a soft, frustrated sigh. "No, not like that." He stepped behind her. The sudden proximity of his body was a shock, a solid wall of warmth at her back. She could feel the heat of him, smell the faint, clean scent of sweat and wood smoke that clung to him. Her breath caught in her throat. "Here," he said, his voice low, close to her ear. His large, scarred hands came up to cover hers, guiding her grip on the rifle stock. The touch was electric, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the weapon she held. His fingers were rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, firm and certain. He adjusted her hands, his thumb brushing against hers. "Hold it like this, firm, like you mean it." His other hand went to her shoulder, pressing the curved butt of the rifle firmly into the soft flesh. "Right here. Let your body take the shock." His chest was pressed against her back, his frame shielding hers, and she could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart. The world seemed to shrink to the small space their bodies occupied, the distant mountains and the vast sky fading to an indistinct blur. "Now, line up your sight," he murmured, his breath stirring the fine hairs on her neck. He leaned his head close to hers, his rough cheek almost touching her temple, guiding her gaze down the long, blue steel barrel. "See the notch on the back and the post on the front? Put the post right on the bottom of that can. Squeeze the trigger slow. Don't jerk it." Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She could barely breathe for the intensity of his closeness. She tried to focus, to see the can, the sight, anything but the overwhelming presence of the man standing behind her. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a deafening roar that ripped through the valley's quiet. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a brutal, powerful kick that sent a shockwave through her entire body. The bullet whined past the can, kicking up a puff of dirt a foot to the left. "You flinched," he said, his voice still calm, still close. He did not move away. "It's natural. You have to fight it. Breathe out and squeeze on an empty breath. Try again." They stood like that for an hour, a single, four-armed creature of wood and steel and flesh. He guided her, corrected her, his body a constant, steadying presence against hers. With each shot, she grew more accustomed to the weight of the rifle, the violence of its report. And with each moment he stood behind her, his hands covering hers. The unspoken longing that had simmered between them for weeks began to boil. Finally, a shot rang out, and the tin can leaped from the post, spinning through the air with a satisfying ping. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, unburdened smile of pure accomplishment. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes bright. "I did it." He was looking down at her, his face only inches from hers. The usual caution in his pale gray eyes was gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded, an emotion she had never seen in him before. It was a mixture of pride and a deep, aching tenderness. The air crackled with a tension that was more explosive than any gunshot. He looked at her mouth, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he would kiss her. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Before he seemed to catch himself, the mask of stoicism slammed back into place. He stepped back, breaking the contact, and the sudden cold where his body had been was a shock. "You did," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Now, load it again. By yourself this time." Even as he taught her his world, she, in turn, began to transform his. The evenings grew longer and colder, and after their sparse meal, the fireplace was their only source of light and warmth. One night, to fill the heavy silence, she picked up the old Bible. "Would you mind?" she asked hesitantly. "If I read aloud?" He had been cleaning a trap, his hands busy, his mind distant. He looked up, surprised, and gave a short, stiff nod. So she began to read. Her voice, clear and educated, was a foreign sound in the rustic cabin, a soothing melody against the bass note of the wind howling outside. She read from the Psalms, her voice lending a quiet power and grace to the ancient words of sorrow and hope. Jed stopped his work. He sat on his stool, his hands resting on his knees, and he listened. He watched the way the firelight played on her face, catching the auburn highlights in her hair, the serious, focused line of her mouth. Her voice was a balm, a gentle rain on the dry, cracked earth of his solitude. It pushed back the ghosts that haunted the cabin's corners, filling the empty spaces with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She became the keeper of their small world. She managed their meager supplies with a careful, intelligent precision, stretching their flour and coffee and salt in a way he had never bothered to. She made their harsh life more bearable, bringing a sense of order and grace to their daily survival. The cabin became a true sanctuary, a place of quiet partnership, They began to talk. The conversation started small, tentative explorations of their pasts. She told him of her life in Ohio, of the green hills and the big bustling towns, of her father before the dream of the West had broken him. He, in turn, shared fragments of his own life before the fever. He spoke of his father, a carpenter who had taught him how to work with wood, and of a childhood spent on a small farm in Missouri. They never spoke of his wife or son, or of her father's final, shameful act. They circled the great, gaping wounds of their lives, speaking instead of the smaller, gentler memories that had made them who they were. The tension between them was a constant, humming wire. It was in the long, lingering looks they exchanged across the small table, in the way their hands would accidentally brush as she passed him a plate, sending a shock through them both. It was in the hyper-awareness of each other's presence in the cramped space, the sound of his breathing in the dark after the lamp was out, the scent of the soap she used on her hair. The desire was a palpable thing, a hunger made more intense by the constant, low-grade fear of the threat that lay waiting outside their valley. That threat soon made itself known again, but in a more insidious way. Their supplies ran low, and a trip to town became unavoidable. Jed was quiet and grim on the ride in, the Winchester resting across his lap. The town of Redemption felt different this time. As they walked down the dusty street towards the general store, he felt the change immediately. Men who had once nodded at him now turned their backs. Women pulled their children closer, their face pinched with disapproval. The air was thick with hostile stares and poisonously whispered words. Bartholomew Thorne had been busy. The story he had woven was a simple and ugly one. The quiet, solitary man Jedediah Stone was a dangerous outcast, a kidnapper who had stolen a poor, indebted man's daughter and was holding her against her will in his isolated valley. The truth of this became brutally clear in the general store. The proprietor, a portly man named Henderson, who had always been civil, stood behind his counter with his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold judgment. "I want flour, coffee, and salt," Jed said, his voice even. Henderson shook his head. "I'm not selling to you, Stone." "I have money," Jed said, placing a few coins on the counter. "Your money is not welcome here," the man said, his voice loud enough for the other customers to hear. "We don't cater to your kind. A man who preys on a helpless girl, steals her from her own father. You're not welcome in this town." A cold, hard fury rose in Jed's chest, but he kept his face impassive. He looked at the hostile faces surrounding him, and he knew it was useless. Thorne's money and influence had bought them all. He swept his coins from the counter and turned to Alara. "We're leaving." They walked out of the store, the weight of the town's collective hatred pressing down on them. They were pariahs. The act of social prejudice was as effective as a locked door, isolating them completely. As they left the town behind, riding back towards the sanctuary of their valley, the truth of their situation settled over them with a chilling finality. They had no one else. The world had cast them out, leaving them with only each other to stand against the darkness. The final attack came a week later, in the dead of a cold, moonless night. Ilara was woken from a restless sleep by a strange, flickering orange light dancing on the cabin wall. Then she smelled it, the sharp, acrid scent of smoke. "Jed!" she screamed, scrambling from her cot. He was already moving, pulling on his boots, his face a grim silhouette against the terrifying glow from the window. "Stay inside and bar the door," he commanded, grabbing a bucket and his rifle as he burst outside. The barn was on fire. Flames were already licking up the dry timber walls of the lean-to, a hungry, roaring beast in the night. It was their food, their shelter for the horse, their winter hay. Losing it meant they would not survive. Ignoring his order, Alara grabbed the other bucket and ran to the creek, her heart pounding with a terror so cold it felt like ice in her veins. She filled the bucket with freezing water, the weight of it staggering her, and ran back towards the inferno. It was a scene from hell. Jed was a frantic, desperate figure, throwing bucket after bucket of water onto the base of the flames, his face black with soot, his movements economical even in his haste. The roar of the fire was a deafening, monstrous sound, punctuated by the crack and splinter of burning wood. They worked together in a frantic, unspoken rhythm. She ran to the creek, filled the buckets, and hauled them back, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming in protest. He took them from her, throwing the water with a desperate accuracy, trying to beat back the relentless flames. They were a team, a single unit fighting for their lives, their movements synchronized by adrenaline and a shared, desperate will. They did not speak. There was no need. In the heart of the chaos, they moved as one. Slowly, impossibly. They began to win. The roar lessened to a hiss. The great leaping flames shrank to smaller, angry pockets of fire. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last ember was extinguished, leaving a smoking, steaming, charred ruin. They stood in the darkness, the only light from the smoldering timbers. They were drenched, covered in soot, and trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of terror. The cold night air raised goosebumps on their skin. The barn was a blackened skeleton, but the main structure, and the horse inside it, had been saved. They had not lost everything. Elara's legs finally gave out. She sank to the ground, her body shaking uncontrollably, and buried her face in her hands, a single, ragged sob escaping her lips. Jed came to her, kneeling in the muddy, ash-strewn dirt beside her. He reached out a hand, hesitant at first, then placed it on her trembling shoulder. "We did it," he whispered, his voice hoarse and raw. You were brave." She looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears, her eyes wide and luminous in the faint, dying glow of the embers. All the barriers between them, all the fear and caution and unspoken words, had been burned away in the fire. In that moment, they were not a man and a woman, a captor and his captive. They were two survivors, stripped down to the raw, aching core of their beings. The emotional dam that had held back a flood of unspoken feeling for months finally broke. The fear of what they had almost lost, the desperation of their isolation, and the deep, unspoken affection that had taken root between them erupted to the surface. He looked at her, truly saw her, not just her beauty or her bravery, but the fierce, resilient spirit that refused to be extinguished. He lowered his head, and his mouth found hers. It was not a gentle or tentative kiss. It was a kiss born of fire and fear, a desperate, passionate, and raw claiming. It was a kiss that tasted of smoke and tears and a winter's worth of pent-up longing. It was not a question, but an answer. It was an affirmation of life in the face of death, a defiant act of love against a world of hatred. He pulled her to her feet, his hands tangled in her wet hair, and led her from the wreckage, back into the quiet, waiting warmth of the cabin. He barred the door behind them, shutting out the darkness, the cold, and the memory of the fire. In the soft lamplight, he gently wiped the soot from her face with the sleeve of his shirt. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was a touch that spoke of reverence, of awe. She reached up and placed her hand on his rough, unshaven cheek. There were no more words to be said. Everything was in their eyes. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his bedroll by the fire. It was a surrender, a moment of profound and absolute connection that sealed their commitment not just as allies in a war for survival, but as lovers. For the first time, in the heart of that vast and dangerous wilderness, neither of them was alone. The fire had forged them into something new. In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace settled over the valley. A period of profound and quiet happiness that felt both miraculous and stolen. They existed in a bubble of their own making, their shared love a defiant, warm light against the memory of the darkness they had fought back. The world outside the valley, with its judgment and its threats, ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the mountains, and each other. They worked the homestead now as true partners, moving with an easy, unspoken rhythm. Their days were filled with the simple, satisfying labor of rebuilding and preparing. They repaired the charred timbers of the barn, their hands often brushing, their shoulders bumping in the close quarters. Each accidental touch was no longer a jolt of surprise, but a soft, welcome spark of connection. Their conversations were no longer just about the necessities of survival, but about the possibilities of a future. "We could clear another acre come spring," Jed said one evening, his voice holding a note of hesitant optimism she had never heard before. "Plant a proper garden, corn, beans, potatoes." "I remember my mother's garden," Alara replied, her voice soft with memory. She grew roses that climbed the fence. Their scent would fill the whole house. A shadow of the old sorrow passed over his face, for the wife who had likely grown her own garden, but it was fleeting. He looked at Alara, and the shadow was replaced by a tender, steady light. "We could try," he said. "We could try to grow roses." They allowed themselves to dream, a luxury neither had possessed for a very long time. They were healing, not just from the fire, but from the older, deeper wounds of their pasts. His long silences were now comfortable, punctuated by shared smiles. Her quiet strength was a constant, reassuring presence for him. The ghosts in the corners of the cabin seemed to have retreated, pushed back by the simple, profound happiness of two people building a life together, moment by moment. Their intimacy was a quiet language spoken in the way she would mend his shirt with careful, practiced stitches, or the way he would bring her a cup of coffee in the morning, just as she liked it. It was a love that had been born not in a quiet courtship, but in the crucible of fear and survival, and it was stronger and more precious for it. But they both knew their peace was a borrowed time. The shadow of Bartholomew Thorne was a promise that had yet to be kept. The shattering of their world came on a cold, gray morning. It was not a sudden sound, but a feeling, a change in the valley's ancient rhythm. A flock of crows burst from the high pines, their frantic cawing an alarm bell in the quiet air. Jed, who had been splitting wood, went utterly still, his axe held halfway through its swing. He lifted his head, his eyes scanning the ridgeline at the valley's entrance, his face hardening into a familiar, grim mask. "Alara," he said, his voice low and devoid of all its recent warmth. "Go inside. Bar the door. Get the rifles." She did not question him. She saw in his face that the day they had dreaded was upon them. Her heart began to pound a heavy, sickening beat against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she ran to the cabin. From the ridge, they came, a line of riders, dark and menacing against the overcast sky. There were 10 of them, maybe more. At their head was a large man on a powerful bay horse, a man who sat in his saddle with an air of absolute, arrogant authority. Bartholomew Thorne had decided to handle the matter himself. He had not come to talk. He had gathered a posse of the cruelest, most desperate men his money could buy, and he had come to kill a man and take a woman. The siege began without a word of warning. The riders fanned out, using the sparse trees and rocky outcrops for cover as they advanced. The first shot was a sharp, ugly crack that echoed through the valley, splintering the wood of the cabin wall just inches from the window. Inside, the fragile peace of the last few weeks evaporated like a mirage. The cabin was once again a fortress, a last desperate bastion against a tide of violence. But this time, Jed was not alone. He had anticipated this day, and he was prepared. Barrels of water were already positioned by the door. Sacks of ammunition lay open on the table. He had reinforced the door with a heavy iron bar and had cut small, clever firing slits into the log walls, almost invisible from the outside. "Stay away from the window," he ordered, his voice calm and steady as he took his position at one of the slits. "They'll aim for any movement." He proved to be a formidable fighter. The solitary man who had carved a life from this valley knew its every rock, its every hollow, its every trick of the light. He fired with a deadly, patient accuracy, his movement stripped of all panic. He was not just a man with a rifle, he was a part of the land, and these invaders were trespassers on his sacred ground. He fought with a cold, controlled fury, not just for his own life, but for the woman behind him, for the scent of roses in a garden they might never plant, for the home they had built in the embers of their old lives. A shot from his Winchester sent one of the riders tumbling from his saddle. Another man, trying to use a large boulder for cover, cried out and clutched a shattered arm. Ilara's transformation was absolute. The frightened, helpless woman who had been dragged into a saloon to be sold was gone forever, burned away in the fire, replaced by the survivor who stood beside him. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but love was a fire in her veins, and the fire was stronger. Her mind was sharp, her hands steady. She became an extension of him, a vital part of their desperate defense. She had loaded his second rifle, a heavy Sharps, and as soon as the hammer fell on an empty chamber in his Winchester, she was there, pressing the fresh rifle into his hands and taking the spent one. She worked in a swift, efficient rhythm, her fingers flying as she ejected the old cartridge, slid a new one into the breech, and primed the weapon. She was a whirlwind of focused energy. Her world narrowed to the task of keeping him armed, of keeping them alive. "To the left," she said, her voice sharp, her eyes peering through another firing slit. "There's a man moving up through the creek bed." Jed shifted his aim, fired, and a curse echoed up from the direction she had indicated. She was his eyes, his partner, his other self. She tended to a graze on his cheek from a splintered piece of wood, her touch light and quick, her face a mask of fierce concentration, a strength she never knew she possessed, fueled by her love for this quiet, steadfast man, surged through her. She would not let them take him. She would not let them destroy this life. She would die here in this cabin before she let that happen. For over an hour, the battle raged. The air grew thick and acrid with the smell of gunpowder. The cabin walls were scarred and splintered, the constant crack of rifles a deafening, chaotic drumbeat. 2 of Thorne's men were down, and several more were wounded. The attackers' initial confidence had been replaced by a grudging respect for the lone defender who fought like a cornered wolf. But they had the numbers, and they were relentless. The emotional climax of the battle came with a sickening, final thud. Jed had leaned out for a fraction of a second too long, trying to get a clear shot at a man who was getting too close to the barn. A rifle cracked from the ridge, and Jed cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pure agony. He staggered back from the firing slit, his left shoulder a sudden, horrifying blossom of red. The Winchester clattered to the floor. He collapsed against the wall and slid to a sitting position, his face ashen, his teeth clenched against a wave of pain. "Jed!" Ilara screamed, her heart seizing with a terror that was colder and sharper than anything she had ever known. He tried to push himself up, tried to reach for the rifle, but his left arm was useless, hanging limp and bloody at his side. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and his head slumped forward. He was incapacitated. The formidable defense of the valley had fallen. Outside, a triumphant shout went up. Thorne's men had seen him fall. They began to advance with a renewed, predatory confidence, moving from cover, believing the fight was over. The end was coming. They would storm the cabin, and Thorne would claim his prize. Ilara looked at Jed, bleeding and helpless on the floor. She saw the man who had stood for her in a saloon, the man who had shielded her from a storm, the man who had shared his own deep sorrow to ease hers. She saw the man she loved, and a cold, protective fury, unlike anything she had ever experienced in her life, washed over her, extinguishing every last flicker of fear. In a moment of supreme, terrifying courage, she scooped the heavy Winchester from the floor. Her hands were not shaking. Her mind was a shard of ice. She stepped over Jed's legs to the firing slit, the long, heavy barrel resting in the notch. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the schoolmaster's daughter. She was the defender of this house, the protector of this man, the first man who broke cover. A hulking brute with a thick red beard was running towards the cabin, a pistol in his hand, a triumphant leer on his face. She remembered Jed's voice in her ear, his body warm against hers. Breathe out and squeeze on an empty breath. She put the sight on the man's chest, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, but this time she was ready for it. The man was thrown backwards as if hit by a giant, invisible fist, a look of utter shock on his face before he crumpled to the ground. A stunned silence fell over the attackers. They had expected to find a weeping, terrified woman. They had not expected this. The ferocity and accuracy of the shot stunned them into a momentary paralysis. "She's got the rifle," someone shouted. "Spread out!" But their momentum was broken. They scrambled back to cover, their confidence shattered. From the ridge, Bartholomew Thorne's voice boomed, thick with rage and disbelief. "What are you waiting for? She's one woman! Rush the cabin! I want him dead and her alive!" Another man tried to advance, keeping low, darting from rock to rock. Ilara tracked him, fired, and the shot kicked up dirt at his heels, forcing him to dive back behind cover. Her skill was not perfect, but her determination was absolute. She was a lioness defending her den, and her raw, protective fury made her a terrifying opponent. She knew she could not hold them off forever. Her ammunition was limited. Her only hope was a desperate, clever tactic. She had to break their will to fight. And the will of these hired thugs came from one place, the man who was paying them. She had to take down the king to scatter the pawns. She scanned the ridgeline, searching for Thorne. He had grown careless, enraged by his men's hesitation and his own frustration. He had stepped out from behind the large pine tree that had been shielding him, standing in the open to better direct the assault, his powerful frame a clear, arrogant target against the gray sky. He thought he was beyond her reach. He was wrong. This was the longest shot she had ever attempted. It was nearly impossible. She rested the heavy barrel of the Winchester on the edge of the firing slit to steady it. Her cheek pressed against the cool wood of the stock. She remembered Jed's lessons, his calm voice, the feel of his hands guiding hers. Line up your sight. Put the post right on the bottom of the target. She ignored the men below. She ignored the pain in her shoulder from the rifle's repeated recoil. She ignored everything but the large, dark figure on the ridge. She took a slow, deep breath, let it out, and as her lungs emptied, her world narrowed to the tiny metal post, the distant target, and the gentle, final squeeze of the trigger. The rifle roared. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, the figure on the ridge gave a great, bellowing cry of rage and pain. Thorne staggered back, clutching his leg, and fell to the ground. That was all it took. The will of the posse shattered. Their leader was down. This was not a cause they were willing to die for. It was just a job, and the pay was no longer worth the price. Cursing, they abandoned the fight, scrambling to retrieve their wounded leader. They dragged him onto his horse and retreated back over the ridge, a defeated, humiliated mob, carrying their fallen commander with them. The immediate, ringing silence that fell over the valley was as shocking as the noise of the battle had been. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, was still. The cabin was a wreck, its walls pocked with bullet holes. Outside, the bodies of two of Thorne's men lay still in the dirt. They had survived. They had won. Ilara let the rifle slip from her numb fingers. It clattered to the floor. The icy resolve that had sustained her melted away, replaced by a wave of shock and horror. Her legs gave out, and she stumbled to Jed's side. His eyes were closed, his face pale and slick with sweat. The blood was spreading in a terrifyingly wide, dark stain across his shirt and the floorboards beneath him. "Jed," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. Her face was streaked with soot and gunpowder, a warrior's mask that was now crumbling. She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head in her lap, her hand pressing futilely against the gushing wound. "Jed, please, stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain. He looked at her, a flicker of love and awe in their depths. His lips moved, forming her name in a faint, ragged whisper. "Ilara." Then his eyes rolled back, and he faded into unconsciousness, his body going limp in her arms. They had survived, but the cost was devastatingly high. The battle was over, but the fight for his life had just begun. The ringing silence in the aftermath of the battle was a hollow, desolate thing. The world, which had been a cacophony of gunfire and shouting, was now unnaturally quiet. The only sounds the whisper of the wind through the pines and the ragged, desperate sound of Ilara's own breathing. The victory was a bitter ash in her mouth. She had saved their home, but she was losing him. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she ruthlessly beat it back down. There was no time for fear. There was only time for action. Jed was a dead weight in her arms, his life spilling out onto the rough floorboards of the home he had fought to defend. She had to get him to the bed, drawing on a reservoir of strength she did not know she possessed. She hooked her arms under his, planting her feet for leverage. He was a tall, solid man, and moving him was a task of Herculean effort. She pulled, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in harsh, tearing gasps. She dragged him across the floor, leaving a terrible, dark smear in his wake, his boots scuffing a mournful rhythm against the wood. With a final, desperate heave, she managed to roll his inert body onto the cot in the corner, his head lolling to one side, his face a ghastly, waxy white beneath the grime and blood. She lit every lamp in the cabin, the multiple small flames pushing back the encroaching shadows, a defiant stand against the darkness that was trying to claim him. With trembling hands, she took his knife and cut away the bloody fabric of his shirt. The wound was a nightmare. The bullet had entered his shoulder from the front, tearing through muscle and flesh, leaving a ragged, ugly hole that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm of dark blood. Her mind raced. She had no doctor's training, only a rudimentary knowledge gleaned from books and a common sense born of a hard life. The bullet had to come out. If it stayed, the wound would fester, and a death by fever and infection would surely follow. Her resolve hardened into something as cold and sharp as steel. She stoked the fire until it was roaring hot, the flames casting dancing, demonic shadows on the walls. She found a bottle of whiskey Jed kept for medicinal purposes, a cleaner, stronger spirit than the rotgut her father had drunk. She poured some on a clean rag to wash the worst of the grime from around the wound, an act that made him moan deep in his unconsciousness. She poured more of the fiery liquid over the blade of his long skinning knife, the alcohol hissing as it evaporated in the heat. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of the knife. This was the man who had saved her, the man she loved with a ferocity that eclipsed all fear, all disgust. Her love demanded this terrible, brutal act. She whispered his name, a prayer and an apology, and then she began to cut. The work was a grim, bloody ordeal. She probed the wound with the tip of the sterilized knife, her own body slick with a cold sweat, her stomach roiling with a nausea she refused to succumb to. He thrashed weakly on the cot, his body reacting to a pain his mind could not register, guttural sounds of agony tearing from his throat. She wept, the tears falling unheeded, mingling with the blood on her hands. But she did not stop. Her entire world narrowed to this terrible, necessary task. Finally, after an eternity of searching, the knife tip scraped against something hard, the bullet. Using the point of the blade and her own fingers, she worked the twisted piece of lead free from the mangled flesh and dropped it with a clatter into a tin bowl. The worst was over, but the fight was not. The wound was still weeping blood. She remembered Jed's lesson about the yarrow plant. She had a bundle of it drying from the rafters. She crushed the feathery leaves into a poultice and packed it firmly into the wound. Then, she took the last of the whiskey and, averting her eyes, poured it directly into the raw opening to cleanse it. Jed's body arched in a silent scream, a convulsion of pure agony that nearly broke her heart, but the bleeding slowed. She tore strips from her cleanest petticoat, her last link to a civilized past, and bound the wound tightly, her hands moving with a desperate, focused precision. When it was done, she collapsed onto the stool beside the cot, her body trembling with a violent, boneless exhaustion. She was covered in his blood, the coppery scent thick in her nostrils. She had done all she could. The rest was in the hands of God and the strength of his own body. The days that followed were a waking nightmare, a long, featureless haze of fear and exhaustion. The fever came, as she had known it would. It took hold of him with a vengeance. burning through him like a wildfire. He was no longer the strong, silent man she knew, but a helpless, thrashing stranger, lost in a delirious world of his own. He cried out for a woman named Mary, his voice full of a desperate, pleading love. He called for a boy named Daniel, begging him to come in from the cold. He fought old battles, his hands clenching at the blankets, his body slick with a constant, drenching sweat. Elara became his guardian, his anchor to the living world. She barely slept, dozing for a few minutes at a time in the stool by his bed, her senses tuned to every subtle change in his breathing. She bathed him in cool water, changing the cloths on his forehead 100 times a day. She forced sips of water and thin broth between his cracked, parched lips. Her entire world shrank to the small, stuffy cabin, to the rise and fall of his chest. It was a quiet, grueling testament to her devotion, a love proven not in the desperate passion of a kiss, but in the selfless, soul-crushing labor of care. She fought for his life with a stubborn, tireless ferocity, refusing to let the fever steal him from her now, not after they had won. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She woke from a fitful doze to find him quiet, his breathing deep and even, his skin cool to the touch. The storm had passed, for the first time in days. A fragile shoot of hope pushed its way through the hard soil of her fear. She slept for a few hours then, a deep, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion, and was woken by a faint, rustling sound. She opened her eyes. He was awake. He was looking at her. His eyes were clear, lucid, and free of the fever's haze. They were the pale, steady gray eyes of the man she knew, the man she loved. The moment their gazes met was a quiet, powerful crest of emotion. He saw her, truly saw her, sitting by his bed, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, her dress stained with his blood, her hair a tangled mess. He saw the warrior who had fought for him, the nurse who had saved him. In his eyes, she saw it all, the recognition, the gratitude, the awe, and a love so profound and unguarded it made her breath catch. His lips moved, and a sound, a dry, rasping whisper, emerged. Elara. Her name. It was the only word he had the strength to say, but it held everything. It was an acknowledgement, a benediction, a homecoming. Tears of pure, unadulterated relief streamed down her face. She took his hand, her small, capable hand enveloping his larger, weaker one, and brought it to her lips. He was alive. He had come back to her. His recovery was a slow, arduous process. The strong, self-sufficient man was now as helpless as a child, and their roles were completely reversed. He, who had taught her everything about survival, now had to depend on her for everything. She was his strength, his protector. She fed him, bathed him, changed the dressing on his wound, and helped him take his first, stumbling steps across the cabin. This new dynamic of vulnerability stripped away the last of his reservations, the final bricks in the wall he had built around his heart. The secrets and sorrows he had held close for so long were finally given voice. In the quiet hours of his recovery, he told her everything. He spoke of Mary, his childhood sweetheart, a woman with a laugh like wind chimes. He spoke of Daniel, his son, a serious, quiet boy with his mother's eyes, who had loved to fish in the creek. He did not speak of their deaths with the clipped, pained brevity of before, but shared the small, beautiful details of their lives. He was entrusting her with his ghosts, not as a burden, but as a gift, making her a part of his entire story, not just the chapter she had walked into. She listened, her heart aching for his loss, but swelling with love for this man who was finally, completely, letting her in. As his strength returned, they began the slow process of rebuilding their world. The work was a balm, a way to reclaim their lives from the violence that had shattered them. Together, they patched the bullet holes in the cabin walls, replacing the splintered logs, making their fortress a home once more. He would sit, directing her as she worked on the things he could not yet do, his respect for her growing with every nail she hammered straight, every log she helped haul into place. When he was strong enough to stand for longer periods, They mended the fences together, their hands often meeting on the same split rail. Each act of reconstruction was a symbol of their resilience, a physical manifestation of their commitment to building a future on this land, together. One evening, as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, they sat on the porch, the work for the day done. Jed had been quiet for a long time, watching the colors of the sunset fade over the mountains. He turned to her, his face serious, his pale eyes full of a humble, reverent light. "When I brought you here, Ilara," he began, his voice low and steady. "I was just acting. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what would become of us. I just knew I couldn't let that happen to you." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the new calluses on her palm. "But it was not my right. I took you from one bad situation and brought you into another. It was a hard, lonely life, and it was not what you deserved. It became our life. Jed," she said softly, "you gave me a home when I had none." "You made it a home," he corrected her, his gaze intense. "I was just surviving. You taught me how to live again." He took a breath, the words coming with a deep, heartfelt gravity. "I don't have much to offer, just this land and my own 2 hands. But everything I have and everything I am is yours. If you'll have it, I'm asking you to be my wife, Ilara, not as part of a bargain or an arrangement, or because of anything that happened in that saloon. I'm asking because I love you, and I want to build a life with you, as your true and equal partner, for all the days we have left." Her heart was so full it felt like it might burst. This was the culmination of their entire journey. From a brutal transaction in a dusty saloon to this pure, unbreakable bond forged in fire and blood. She looked at this good, honorable man, his face scarred and weathered, his body still healing from the wounds he had taken for her. For them. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with happy tears. "Yes, Jedediah Stone, I will be your wife." The epilogue of their story was not written in a single, dramatic chapter, but in the quiet, steady passage of years. The homestead was no longer a stark, lonely cabin in a vast wilderness. It was a thriving small ranch, a testament to their shared labor and unyielding spirit. The once empty corral now held a small herd of sturdy cattle. A large, prosperous garden bloomed every spring and summer, overflowing with corn and beans, and yes, even a few hardy, stubborn rose bushes that climbed a neat white fence. The silence of the valley was no longer absolute. It was often broken by the sound of children's laughter. First came a boy, a quiet, serious child with his father's pale gray eyes, whom they named Daniel. 2 years later, a daughter was born, a bright, fearless girl with her mother's auburn hair and indomitable spirit. They named her Hope. The land was still harsh. The winters were still brutal. The summers still hot and dry. Life was still a daily struggle against the unforgiving elements. But it was their life, a good life, a full life, built with their own hands on a foundation of love and mutual respect. The ghost of Bartholomew Thorne had never returned. The story of his humiliating defeat at the hands of a lone woman had followed him, and he had eventually sold his ranch and moved on, his power broken. The final scene of their story unfolded on a warm summer evening, nearly a decade after the siege. Jed and Ilara stood on the porch of their cabin, which now had a proper new room added onto it. He was broader now, his face more deeply lined, but his eyes, when they looked at her, held the same steady, unwavering love. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, and she leaned against his solid strength as naturally as breathing. A faint, silver scar was visible on his shoulder, just above the collar of his shirt, a permanent reminder of all they had survived. The sun was setting, painting the sky over their valley in breathtaking strokes of orange, pink, and purple. Their children played in the yard below, their happy shouts echoing in the clear mountain air. They did not need to speak. Their shared life was a long, comfortable conversation that never ended. They had overcome tragedy, prejudice, and violence. They had faced down their demons, both internal and external, and had found not just survival, but justice, peace, and a love that had become their own quiet, enduring monument. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on the story in English.